Down here is where I store all of my offcuts and scraps. On the left, I've got all hardwood scraps. These are the slightly longer pieces like this, and then on the top shelf, shorter pieces like this. And on the right is softwoods, so again, longer pieces and shorter pieces. And as you can see, this section here is getting pretty full, so I'm going to use some of this stuff today. So here's what I've pulled out, although I probably won't use all of this. First, I've got some salvaged drawer fronts. These came from an old chest of drawers I found in the streets. They've got kind of this carved or engraved pattern on them. It'd be cool to use those for something. Then I've got a bunch of oak. This stuff with the finish applied came from some old library bookshelves. You can see here they've still got some biscuit joint holes in from where they were joined to some oak veneered MDF. And then I've got this. No idea where this came from or how long I've had it or what type of wood it is either. One side's got a finish applied, a couple of offcuts of sapele here, and then I've got these pieces. These came from the doors of a glass cabinet that I found out in the streets as well. It's obviously been out in the rain for quite a while, as you can probably tell. I'm just going to run a hand plane over this to see what it looks like underneath. It looks like it's got some sort of inlay, but some of it's damaged already. Let's see if it's salvageable. That looks pretty cool, so I'm going to use that as it is. There's a few areas where there's some damage, but I'm sure I can use some of this. So the first piece cleaned up okay, but on the second piece, the inlay is just too damaged, so I don't think this piece is going to be salvageable. I first ripped the edges clean at the table saw, and then I cleaned up the ends at the miter saw. Then I found the centre and cut the piece in half so that I could put the two pieces together. I applied wood glue and added some clamps. I decided to make use of the piece with the damaged inlay too, to make a second rack. I first ripped one edge clean and then ripped off the damaged inlay. Then I found some pieces of oak that were roughly the same thickness, and after ripping the edges clean, I glued and clamped the oak pieces on either side. I'd use more oak to make a third rack. I cut two pieces to the same length at the miter saw, and then I cleaned up both pieces with a hand plane to remove the old finish and square up the edges. I checked the edges were square and then sanded both pieces at 120 grit. I figured it'd be easier to sand these pieces while I had good access to them before gluing them together, because I wanted this rack to have a shelf. Here I'm gluing and clamping one to the other at a right angle. Then for a fourth rack, I took some more oak and measured the thickness, and then ripped the pieces of sapele I had to that size. And while at the table saw, I also cleaned up the edges of the oak. And I could glue and clamp those together too. Next I turned my attention to the drawer fronts, first removing the screw for the handles. The handles were glued too, so I used my mallet to break the glue joint. There were also some pin nails protruding from the surface, so I pulled those out too. I used my hand plane to clean up the faces, and this wood looks like oak to me. Both of these drawer fronts needed some repairs. This piece had a crack running down the edge, so I wedged a screwdriver in there to open up the gap and then put some glue inside, and I tried to get as much glue in there as I could before adding some spring clamps. Then it was onto the second drawer front, and this one had a crack along the width of the piece. So again, I got as much glue in there as I could, and then I clamped on a couple of battens to get a nice tight glue joint and to keep the workpiece flat. And once the glue had dried, the repair looked pretty good, but I added some of this oak wood filler to try and disguise the crack a little more. And I just used a small scrap of wood to scrape away the filler from the engraved part. There was one more repair needed, and that was to replace a broken corner. So I cut a wedge of oak on the bandsaw and I glued it in place. I'd already chiselled the area where I'm now applying the glue to get it perfectly flat before adding the new corner. Once the glue had dried, I could cut the edges flush at the bandsaw. And then I planed the back to get the new corner piece flat. I also used my block plane to clean up the end grain. Then I wet the grain just to see how it would look, and it was a pretty nice repair. Next I got my thickness planer set up, and now that all of the glue had set on the pieces I laminated earlier, I could run them through to clean up the faces. The piece with the inlay was too delicate to put through the electric planer, so I just took a few shavings from the glue joint with my block plane. And then I decided that a decorative bevel would look nice, so I did that by holding the block plane at roughly a 45-degree angle. And I did that on both long edges. I also added a bevel to a couple of the other racks. Next I could trim the ends of all of the racks at the miter saw. Here I'm flashing up the joint where the shelf meets the back of the rack that was made of 2 pieces of oak using my block plane. Back to the drawer fronts again, and I ripped the edges at the table saw just to clean them up. And I trimmed the ends. I wanted to add a round over to these to soften the look of them. I did this with a hand plane rather than using a router with a roundover bit, as I just find it more enjoyable to shape things this way, and also I like how the roundover looks a bit more organic. Then I sanded all of the racks at 120 grit with my random orbit sander. I had to take it easy on the inlaid piece again because it was fragile. I bought some of these small antique brass coloured hooks on Amazon, and they came with screws. These are inexpensive and they're from China, so they took a few weeks to arrive, but they look pretty good I think, and these seemed the perfect size to hold keys. I made some reference marks to help position the hooks evenly. I used an awl to mark the hole positions and then used a 1mm drill bit to drill a pilot hole. I first added hooks evenly spaced from each end. Then I measured the distance between the 2 hooks, and using a calculator I could figure out the distance between the next ones so that they would all be evenly spaced. I applied boiled linseed oil to the racks for finish. I used this on the other racks too. And then I could add the rest of the hooks. Back to the drawer fronts again, and after sanding I applied boiled linseed oil to one of them and rustic pine brie wax to the other. I should really start wearing gloves when using this wax because this stuff gets under your nails and your hands end up looking pretty grubby. Here you can see the corner repair that I did earlier, which is now barely visible. I rubbed some wax into the crack repair I made earlier too, just to disguise it a bit more. I have quite a few double hooks that I removed from some salvage hat and coat stands, and I'd use these with the drawer fronts to make hat and coat racks. To hide the old screw hole from the handles, I could position a coat hook over it, and then I added another 2 coat hooks evenly spaced. It's been a couple of weeks since I finished working on the racks, and I've been waiting for these to arrive. These are keyhole plates, and they came from China, hence why they took so long to arrive. They're relatively cheap. I paid £3 for 20 of these, and I'm going to mount these to the back of each of the racks, and then people will be able to hang them up on the wall without any visible screws on the front of the racks. As all 4 of the racks are similar in length, I'm thinking of making a drilling template so that I can place these keyhole plates an equal distance apart on each of the racks. So I'm going to measure the shortest one, which is 28 centimeters. So if I space the keyhole plates 20 centimeters apart, that should work for each of the racks. This offcut of oak veneered MDF is going to be my template, and I'll start by drawing a straight line down the length. Then I'm going to use my awl to make 2 marks 20 centimeters distance apart. Then using my speed square, I'm going to square off those marks. Then I'll offer up one of the keyhole plates and center the hole, and then mark up with an awl the bottom hole. Now I can drill out those holes, and now I'll offer up the template to the rack, making sure that it's centered, and drill the holes. And I'm using some 10mm screws to hold the keyhole plates in place. Now when someone wants to hang the rack on a wall, they can just make 2 marks 10 centimeters apart, drill the holes, add some screws using wall plugs if necessary, and then the keyhole plates on the back of the racks can push nicely onto the screw heads, and you can push it down to get a nice solid fixing. So that's the key and coat racks finished. I think this project took just over a day in total, and the items are now for sale on my Etsy store. This project was mainly just about using up some hardwood scraps, but also restocking my Etsy store, which I've been intending to do for a while. I'm pleased with how the key racks turned out. I'm less keen on the coat racks, to be honest, not really my cup of tea, but hopefully someone out there will like them. Thanks for watching.